back gifts for Hannah and Margaret from a trip to Istanbul. I was very careful and came with two identical little change purses with a beautiful mosque stitched on them. But then I messed up. So I had with me the little packet of items some airlines give you on long flights. I didn't give it as a gift, more just as here's some stuff to play with. This was a terrible mistake. Soon the air was shattered with a huge argument over who would get the lip balm. Sometimes Hannah and Margaret have trouble sharing. Speaking of sharing, yesterday was election day. Elections often seem like unpleasant fights, with lots of people screaming, "No fair," with even less control than my daughters. I, however, love elections. More precisely, I love what happens when the results are announced. Those who lose the election concede, congratulate the winner, and become what the British call the loyal opposition. Yesterday, the Democrats lost control of the Senate and failed to gain control of the House. But they have not refused to accept the results and formed an alternative government, nor have they taken to the streets rioting. We have agreed as a society not to grab the lip balm and run, or even worse, to start pulling hair. Instead, we continue to play together, perhaps with some resentment, but in peace. In exchange, we have several important agreements in place. We agree on protecting minority rights, and we agree that the next set of elections will not be too long from now. This is a form of sharing. The victorious party is not literally sharing power at that moment, but it is sharing power in the sense of being willing to play by the rules. Similarly, the minority party is conceding power with the understanding that it will have another opportunity to voice its beliefs. Sharing is only possible with trust. You have to trust that people with whom you are sharing something, the lip balm or governmental power, will return it when it is your turn. Trust, however, is only possible when we conquer fear, especially fear of being taken advantage of. When have you feared being taken advantage of? As adults, we recognize that there is always another little container of lip balm around the corner. But you might fear being taken advantage of in another way, in a group project, or a friend using something private you have told them as gossip. Seniors, you might feel defensive of your time as we move slowly closer to the moment you graduate. Recently, I have had the privilege of visiting 3 places that might be among the hardest on earth to share. Several years ago, I visited the Great Mosque of Cordoba, built in 784, but converted to a church after Christians expelled all Muslims and Jews from Spain in 1492. Several times in this last decade, Spanish Muslims have asked for permission to pray there and have been denied. Visiting is a fascinating experience. When you enter the space, the simple, clean, striped arches immediately evoke a sense of the Muslim world, even as the ornate Catholic altar rises in the middle. Second, this summer, the St. Andrew's Holy Land trip stood in Jerusalem, on the spot the Bible originally refers to as Mount Moriah. On the site of an ancient Canaanite altar, the forefathers of the Jews built a temple when they took over the land they called Israel. After the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the Christians briefly built a church on the Temple Mount. When Muslims conquered the land then called Palestine, they identified this as the place from which the Prophet Muhammad had stopped on a journey to heaven, and built an incredible domed building over the rock at the hill's summit. 47 years ago, Israelis came into control of Jerusalem again. Now, since the 600s, Jews have worshipped at a wall on one side of the complex, and Muslims have worshipped on the top part, which they call the Haram al-Sharif. Recently, however, more and more conservative Israeli leaders are encouraging people to go up to what they call the Temple Mount to pray. In June, we were gazing at the bright glory of the Dome of the Rock when we heard a bit of a commotion. Someone came to me and said, "People are shouting Allahu Akbar at a man praying." My first reaction was to make sure I knew where all my students were. And then we went over to see what was happening. A man wearing a yarmulke was praying and walking, accompanied by Israeli police. You may remember Thomas Lindemann referring to this story earlier this year in chapel. Were the police escorting the man off or allowing him to complete his rounds? We could not tell. Since our visit, the controversy about the Temple Mount has increased, with violent Palestinian responses to their fear that the Israelis are trying to take over this sacred spot. My third example comes from just this past Friday. Thanks to St. Andrew's, I was standing under the massive dome of the building in Istanbul, Turkey, called the Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. As I looked up, I could see both the Christian representation of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus and the elegantly painted Arabic calligraphy for Allah and Muhammad. It was evening, and the light faded in the windows built 1,500 years ago. This arching sacred place was constructed as a church, then turned into a mosque when Islam took over the city. Most recently, under a Turkish ruler opposed to most forms of religion, it was made into a museum. I could feel the multiple layers of meaning as the murmurs of visitors echoed off the walls. So we have three places, all of which are identified as sacred by multiple religions. And there are more examples. The World Religions class that Ms. Connors teaches has recently examined a Hindu-Muslim struggle over the holy place of Ayodhya in India. Each group is ready to call out with Hannah and Margaret, "No fair." I can identify with the feeling of not wanting to be taken advantage of. I know that when I'm in a country for the first time, as a traveler, I am often overly defensive, not wanting to be taken for a stupid tourist. I have found myself in taxis fiercely negotiating with the driver for the equivalent of 25 cents. I really should, in those moments, take a step back and remember that there are worse things than being willing to give a little extra for valuable service, especially to someone who could use it a lot more than I could. And if trust on a personal scale is sometimes difficult, then trust on a global scale is even more daunting. After all, there are times when you shouldn't trust. The Native Americans were right not to trust the expanding United States. and African Americans still sometimes live in well-justified fear of some white Americans. European nations existed in a state of near constant war with each other for 1,000 years. In the last half-century, however, we have slowly been building trust between majority-minority Americans, between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, between French and Germans. What have we been doing then, and need to continue to do, to encourage this trust? The ethicist Peter Singer has spoken of expanding circles of empathy. He argues, quote, "If I have seen from an ethical point of view that I am just one person among the many in my society, I am ready to see that from a still larger point of view, my society is just one among other societies. Taking this to its logical conclusion means accepting that we ought to have equal concern for all human beings." Close quote. The Buddhists state this a different way, as the meditation on universal loving kindness that you picked up at the entrance shows. They begin with the following prayer: "May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live with ease." Then, as you see, they say it for a widening circle of people. For those they love, then for those they know, then for those they don't know, and then even for their enemies. If we can wish well to those whom we fear, then our fear will subside. If our fear subsides, our trust will increase. If our trust increases, then we can share. If we begin by sharing our lip balm, we can move to sharing our political power. And perhaps we can even stretch, eventually, to sharing our most sacred spaces. Perhaps we, and by we I mean all of humanity together, will someday come to a time when we can worship at the Mosque Church in Cordoba, on the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, and at the Hagia Sophia side by side.